Do Americans really not use passports? You don't need a passport for any domestic purpose. Americans only use their passport when they go to another country. Since America is comprised of states, and every state is still under America, there's no need to use a passport. I am from Germany but live in the States for 18 years now on a green card. Used my German passport strictly for traveling overseas back in the days. When I moved to the States, I was initially really surprised how many Americans didn't have a passport, but I realized quickly that most Americans are not really going overseas. Not really the need to, considering all the different landscapes here. And I love the fact that you can just use your driver license to fly within the United States. That includes me as well. I work in a more rural area now, and most of my coworkers have never even been on a plane. When I first met my American wife, she never owned a passport either. Lol. Well, we changed this quickly, and her first trip to Germany in 2018 was a mind-opening experience for her. She loved it. I saw the post, so I can add a little more context. Approximately half of the US has a valid passport, according to the State Department. The percentage difference has to do with people responding to surveys. The estimate is closer to a third. vs. the number of valid passports in circulation, closer to a half. Regardless of the percentage, a lot of Europeans express surprise that a lot of Americans don't have passports. Since Americans don't typically need passports for domestic travel, there's exceptions for entry into Guam and American Samoa, where a U.S. citizen might need a passport depending on the point of entry. These places also tend to not be major sources of travel for the majority of Americans anyway. A lot of Americans don't bother paying for obtaining or maintaining a passport. As others have pointed out, we don't typically need passports for domestic travel, and we have alternative ID and documentation that can be used for other government purposes. Obtaining a passport costs a lot of time and money. Most Americans aren't going to jump through the hoops to get a passport when other forms of identification and documentation are significantly easier to obtain. It only makes sense to get a passport once one needs to travel internationally. Yes, most Americans don't have passports. And as a European, I've got to say it's surprising to hear you commonly use it for other stuff. Most people I know just have their ID for voting or similar. The only times I've seen people use it for that is if they for whatever reason didn't have the ID. Like they lost it. Most Americans never have a passport. Only like 1/3 ever bother getting one, and even after that many don't use it. The state-issued driver's license is the typical form of identification used for official matters within the states. Canadian here, but similar culture to Americans. I keep my passport in my home safe because it's a major hassle to replace it if it's lost or stolen. My driver's license works as ID for any domestic purposes and can be replaced within a day for under $100. I don't think you can generalize Europe like this. I was born in a EU country. Now I live and work in another EU country. And I never had a passport in my life. Our national ID cards and health number cards are enough for all official paperwork. The only people I know that have passports are the ones that used it to travel outside the EU. Dude. Like I am Dutch, I live right next to you in the EU and I don't have a passport either. We also have ID cards here that function as passports within Europe and a few associated ex-European colonies, but not outside of that area. You'd use your ID card for anything that would require you to ID yourself. See what I did there? I think Americans primarily use their driver's license for ID. America is about the same size as the EU. I personally haven't ventured outside of the EU in almost a decade. So it's not overly surprising to me that many Americans don't have passports. Edit for non-geographers. There's a difference between size, vs, area, lat, long distribution, population size, territorial size, etc. Can all apply to size. America is of course bigger by land area alone. You can use a passport as an ID in the US, but it's just not as common for people to even have one. It's expensive and harder to obtain, so unless you plan on international travel or it's required for a job, the average citizen will likely not bother. Each state issues an ID in the form of a driver's license or state ID. Same thing but without driving privileges. So that's what people get. We do not use our passports for anything other than going to other countries. We use our driver's licenses for everything else. I actually lost my driver's license and then had to use my passport for a few weeks to do things like get a prescription filled, and it felt weird. There are rare occasions when you need two forms of identification, and a passport can be used as one of them. I am over 50 years old and never had a passport. Something like 40% of Americans have a valid passport, until travel to Mexico and Canada started to require one. The figure was half that. State-issued driver's licenses or non-driver ID cards serve the function as identification for most purposes. Also of note, there's no requirement to carry one on your person unless you're operating a motor vehicle. In most cases, there is no utility to carrying a passport for internal purposes. I own a passport for travel to Canada, and it did come in handy when I lost my driver's license the day before I took a flight. Whether to even require an ID to vote is somewhat of a political controversy, as the people that don't have an ID card are more likely to vote Democratic. Nope. Never used one. Never had one. Don't need one. Have an ID for all identification needs, and sometimes SSN comes up. Nope. It's all considered one country here. So we actually don't need any ID or documentation at all unless we're going into a non-US place. Certain modes of transportation will require you to have an ID. Like if you personally are driving, you will need to be licensed and have your driver's license. Or I think airlines usually check your ID at some point in the process. Not sure. I don't fly a lot. Trains may or may not be similar. I don't think buses would probably check. And of course you are free to ride a bike or walk wherever you want within the borders without any paperwork at all. But if you leave the country and enter another, you will need to have your passport. I think there may be some rare exceptions, but it's better to assume there are not unless you know better. My passport expired years ago. It seems my wife wants us to go to Europe again, so I'd better renew it. Glad I saw this sub and was reminded to check. I live in Germany and we use it a lot for official functions, without traveling. For example, to go vote. Perhaps you're confusing ID and passport? I've never seen anyone here use a passport for any official function. We have driver's licenses that fit in our wallets. Carrying a big weird booklet around everywhere is completely unnecessary in the States. Americans typically use driver's licenses or state IDs to apply for jobs, register to vote, and sometimes to vote, prove their age to buy alcohol or smokes, etc. You're also legally supposed to have your driver's license on your person while driving. Passports are more expensive than driver's licenses here usually, and there's a waiting list to get them.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Ericast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.